So I have a question for you. Have you ever read some laws in the Torah that simply do not seem right to you? You're reading this and you're saying to yourself, this is not right. It just does not sit well with me. It's not that it's hard to understand. It's not that it doesn't make sense. It actually does. It's quite simple language. But you just really wonder, why did God have to even allow this and put this in Torah? Sometimes I'm like that. I'm with you if that's what's going through your mind sometimes. And some laws for us modern people are always problematic. And so Parashat Mishpatim begins with the laws about slaves and slavery. A touchy topic. It's not an easy topic to discuss at all, especially in America because of colonial slavery that people are familiar with here in this country. It was truly brutal. It was truly unjust. It was inhumane. I don't know. There's no other ways to describe it. The mistreatment of slaves in America is not a really even such a distant past if we think about it. And as we live our lives today, there's still ghosts of that past with us. And anything we say or do that touches on this topic, if I even just say the term slavery, it colors our discussion. And the tension is absolutely inescapable if I just to mention that term. It is, because of the history that we have and a history that we're familiar with. So, as we read the Torah now, we encounter slavery. Here we are. However, what I want you to understand, it is actually quite different. Torah does not abolish or even criticize slavery. Did you notice that? Neither, for that matter, does Yeshua or Jesus or Paul, or for that matter, the New Testament doesn't really do away with it either. And corrupt people have used the Bible to legitimize, to justify, and perpetrate oppression of others through slavery for generations. That's been the case. It doesn't mean that this is something ideal. If you read the Torah carefully, you will see that God radically redefined the rules of slavery for Israel. Slavery was something that existed in the world at that time, and since the beginning of time perhaps. But when Israel has its moment of accepting the Torah as the Constitution, God chooses to take what they know and change it, completely redefine it. Why? What do I mean by that? Well, how about this? Slaves not working on Shabbat? In the ancient world? Unheard of. What are you talking about? You're a slave. You can keep on working. I get to rest if I want to, but you do. Special rights for women who shared bedroom with their masters? Who were slaves? What are you talking about? Unheard of in the ancient world. Only in Israel this would actually even be a matter. Slave or land ownership was not total, absolute, or even perpetual in ancient Israel. Just look at the laws of land ownership. And the same thing with slavery. No other nation was known to release slaves every 7 years. Come on. No other nation has ever done that. But that's exactly what we read in the Parsha Israel is commanded to do. 7 years? So you see, it's not really ownership. It's much more of a contractual relationship. No other nation would take the land that other people have lost due to their misfortune and restore to them every 50 years. That just didn't happen. What I'm trying to say, these things exist in Torah, and we want to parallel them to the rest of society. But God has redefined things like slavery and land ownership and economics in general for Israel as we read the Torah. So while the words strike us in a very familiar way, we're really not talking about the same exact thing. So as hard it is for us to try to think of, what we're reading in Torah as being different from the recent history and from the abuses that we're familiar with, we have to. And so think of it in a broader sense. Think of it in the context of Torah. In the broad scheme of things, working for others and merely to survive describes the life of countless generations, regardless of their national origin or skin pigmentation. Let's just look at the history of the world. Many people have been just working to barely survive, to just eat another day. And most of us should be able to identify, because of that, with someone who works hard and with slavery. And Israel is constantly taught in Torah never to forget that we were slaves in Egypt. I mean, how many times do we read this in Torah? Do not forget that you were slaves in Egypt. Jews are not allowed to forget this, so that we may never perpetrate injustice and cruelty and an ill fate that has befallen us upon others. I think that is a really big lesson. And by the way, in Hebrew, the word slave, eved, describes really the function of labor. It means someone who works, it means a servant, it means a slave, it means a worker. And designations like servant and slave that we make difference about, this means somebody who's free or somebody who's not free. Ancient Hebrew actually does not differentiate in that. So as we read from the scroll, and we make different sort of say translations based on context, the scroll actually doesn't. It's just eved. And as we look at service or work, avodah, some people have a very low view of labor, especially labor that's done with your hands. Some people view service of any kind as something below them. They deem themselves to be their own masters. But my friends, it's a myth. You may have heard Bob Dylan and his famous song. He says, "You've got to serve somebody. It may be the devil or may be the Lord, but you have to serve somebody." You heard that song?
Yes.
Bob Dylan, good Jewish kid. You know, Robert Zimmerman, by the way. So, okay. You know, in his words, in many ways, what he said in that song really reflects what Torah says. We all serve somebody. Societal status aside, we all have someone over us, if you think about it. We may not call someone a master. We may not address them that way, but we still serve someone out there. And so our Parsha says that in Israel, slaves were allowed to leave. And I think that's remarkable. And what's even more remarkable, and at least for me, maybe you too, they could choose to stay. Not just to leave, but choose to stay. Now, who would want to be a slave voluntarily? Any hands going up in the room? And why? Why would you want to be a slave? This is where the dreaded image of slavery that we hold in our minds because of the recent past that we have had breaks down, because Torah actually suggests this wild notion that a slave would want to stay. A slave loving his master so much that he would choose to forego his freedom, this moment, this opportunity, and chooses to remain to be a slave. Now, this does not make sense in the context of oppression and inhumane treatment and abuse. But apparently, if we read the Torah for what it is, that is not how such relationship was supposed to work. At least not in Torah. Torah assumes that a slave can love his master. So in Exodus 12:1 that we just read, Torah says, if a slave said, "Achavti et Adoni," I love my master, "Et ishti ve'et banai," my wife and my sons, "Lo etzeh chofshi," I do not want to go free. If he says that, he could stay. And beyond that, he can even formalize his decision that he doesn't want to go. So a lot of times I give you kind of these principles that we need to derive from the Torah for today's life. Today, I don't really have principles, but I do have some questions that you have to answer. And my first question is this: do you love your master? And we all serve somebody. Remember that, right? We all do. Do you love your master? If you don't love your master, you have to understand that it doesn't have to be like that. There is a way out. There's a choice. You can serve someone who is good to you. This is what Torah shows to us. We can. In ancient Israel, people became slaves really out of desperation, because they couldn't take care of themselves. There was no one that they knew, no family members that would take care of them. They had to live somewhere. They had to live somehow. So what did they do? They would go and they sell themselves into slavery. And they would have a place to live, and meal to eat, and a place to live and continue on. And in a way, they would become someone's dependent through this relationship that they themselves establish. But as they do in Israel, they were not stuck forever. That was not something that now forever is their status. They could leave. They could be redeemed by someone. Some relative comes out and says, I want you. I finally scraped up some money. I'm going to buy you out. You can be redeemed. Or they can wait 7 years and go free. You see, it's very different. Now, God's relationship with his people, curiously, in the Torah, the language that is being used is the language of redemption from slavery. You've read the Torah. Israel served Pharaoh, and later they served the Lord. Now, the Bible calls Israel both banim, sons, and abadim, slaves, or servants, however you wish to translate it. Remember, I told you there's no difference in Hebrew. In Torah, Israel is firstborn. And Israel's firstborn literally belonged to the Lord. Remember that? God says, the firstborn are mine. Israel has to redeem the firstborn with money. Animals and people. They are God's. The ritual of Pidyon Haben that people still practice today is based on this very idea. Now the Levites, they're exempt. They don't get to be redeemed. They belong to the Lord permanently. The second question that I have for you is, if you indeed love your master, have you declared your love, and did you make a commitment to stay indefinitely? If you do have a master who is like that, who is worthy of your love, have you formalized that relationship? Did you do it? Now, because Hashem is that kind of a master, and one would choose and want to serve him forever. Now, remember the story of the prodigal son? He comes back home, and what does he beg his father? That, just give me a place. I'm willing to be a slave in your house. I don't deserve to be your son. I've already squandered everything you gave me. I just want to be a slave. And remember that story. This is the kind of master that you want to declare your love to forever and say, I'm never leaving. So in ancient Israel, they had a ritual where you had to stand by the mezuzah, by the doorpost. That's what the Torah says, by the mezuzah. Now you know what's on mezuzot. Hashem's name. His commandments are written on our doorpost. So you stand by the mezuzah and get your ear bored through, and you get an earring out of this, you shed some blood, and now you're bound to your master. Well, what can I tell you? We're not going to do this. Rituals change. Time change. We're not going to start putting earrings into people's ears. But the covenant relationship, it doesn't change. That's a constant. Prophets called the Messiah, by the way, also an Eved. Eved Hashem, that's how he's described in the scrolls. And at the same time, he's king. You see what I mean? We all serve somebody. So you have a king who is also a servant of Hashem. The Messiah is not autonomous. Remember, he says, there's nothing I do that unless my Father tells me. And so the will of the one who sent him is what the king even does. Work, labor, service, whatever we're thinking about as we think about this topic of slavery, it is inescapable. We all serve someone, and it is honorable. So choose a good master today and make a commitment to stay forever. I don't know if you realize this or not, because sometimes rituals fall on our deaf ears. But every week when we finish reading the Messiah passage, we say these words, I hereby join myself to the Master. Yeshua the Messiah, the righteous one, who is the bread of life and the true light, the source of eternal salvation for all who believe in him. That's what we do every week. We commit ourselves to our Master, to Yeshua. We're basically saying, we're slaves and you are our Master. And we are willingly entering into this agreement with you. So we ask to remain in him as he remains in the Father, and they both remain within us. It is a mystery of a relationship, but that is how we, every service, articulate that. Now, if those words didn't mean much to you, maybe because sometimes rituals do fall flat on us. I hope that next time they come around, if you haven't made that commitment, maybe you will commit yourself to your master.